Hello. In the last video, we talked about the Catholic response to the rise of Protestantism. As we saw from the 1540s, the Church initiated a comprehensive program that was intended both to shore up their own supporters and to counter the Protestant threat head-on. This movement is called the Catholic Reformation, or the Counter-Reformation. They're the same thing. As we saw, the Catholic Reform movement had three essential elements to it. The first was the establishment of the Roman Inquisition. The point of the Inquisition was to root out heresy, get rid of it, destroy it, eliminate it. But then there was the establishment of the Jesuits. These would be the shock troops of the Reformation. These would carry the Catholic message to heretical areas, but also to new areas as well. The final element was the Council of Trent. This was a massive church council led by the Pope, sitting in the Italian city of Taranto right through the middle of the 16th century. And its purpose was nothing less than to define every element of Catholic belief. Catholicism emerges from this process a completely reinvigorated force. Catholics now had the ideological and institutional tools they needed to take on Protestantism directly. So by the middle of the century, by the middle of the 16th century, Europe is divided between two ideologically opposed camps. Both, of course, are heavily armed, and both believe that their enemy is in league with the forces of the Antichrist. There can be no compromise in a situation like that. A violent confrontation, obviously, was down the road. When this confrontation came, it came first in France, and it would consume that country in a round of devastating civil wars through the second half of the 16th century. But as we'll see in this video, peace was finally restored only in the 1590s, when the French king, a Calvinist, converted to Catholicism. This, as we'll see, is King Henry IV. To cement the peace in his kingdom, Henry realized that it was important to be Catholic. He converted from Calvinism to Catholicism for wholly pragmatic, practical reasons. As we'll see in France, the decision to remain Catholic was as political as the decision in England to break with Rome. Through the Middle Ages, through the High Middle Ages, the kings of France had a number of prominent showdowns with the Catholic Church. French kings had a number of grievances through the High Middle Ages, particularly over whether they had the right to tax the Church. The Church said no, the French kings predictably said yes they did. Despite what the Pope may say, though, of course, he never really has the power to get the French king to ease up. The Pope has no soldiers of his own. So if the French king wants to tax the Church in France, the Pope can complain about it. The Pope can excommunicate the French king. But that's about it. But the French kings went further than this. They demanded certain rights over the Church. In particular, they demanded the right to appoint bishops to important positions in the French Church. They, of course, wanted to make sure that they had sympathetic people involved in high positions in the French Church. The result is that by the middle of the 15th century, the Pope in Rome actually has very little direct power over the Church in France. In most matters, it's the King of France who controls the Church. This is very interesting, because it means that the French king has pretty much all the powers that Henry VIII claimed in England with the Act in Restraint of Appeals. But the French kings got that power by the 1430s, and they remained part of the Catholic world. Henry VIII didn't get these powers until 1533, and he had to break with Rome to get them. This is important because it means that beyond the basic message of Protestantism, beyond any basic appeal that might have to them, there'd be little in it for the French crown if it decided to go with the Reformation. That said, French authorities were actually very slow to deal with Luther and his ideas when they first showed up. We know that Luther's books are being keenly snapped up by Parisians as early as 1519. They were being bought, and then they were being passed around hand to hand. The French Church, of course, quickly declares all of Luther's writings heretical. But in this early period, French kings were reluctant to prosecute Lutheran heretics. One reason for this is that the king's sister was actually quite sympathetic to some of Luther's ideas. In fact, she often hosted gatherings which featured some well-known French Lutherans. But Protestant ideas began to make inroads in France by the 1540s. Remember, of course, Calvin was a Frenchman. And though he's based in Geneva by the 1540s, he's determined to flood France with all sorts of Calvinist writings. Calvinist propaganda is pouring into France. Remember Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion? Well, he has that translated into French in 1541, and copies pour across the border into France. Because of Calvin's efforts, by the middle of the 16th century, there's a strong, vibrant Calvinist tradition in France. These French Calvinists call themselves Huguenots. We don't actually know where this term comes from. One French Calvinist claimed in 1566 that it was a nickname that stemmed from the medieval French romance about a certain King Hugo. Another explanation is that it's a Gallicized version of a Swiss-German word for Confederates, Eidgenossen, which becomes Huguenots, which becomes Frankified and becomes Huguenot. Generally, the people who converted to Calvinism in France tended to be slightly better educated. These are people who came from trades or professions that involved literacy. So lawyers, administrators, record keepers, merchants, trades which involved literacy as being a prominent part of their business. But in France, in particular, Calvin's message took root with the nobility. This is a bit worrying. Remember the solution that the Holy Roman Empire adopted with the Diet of Augsburg in 1555? The religion of the prince will be the religion of the region. But what happens if something similar was to happen in France? What happens if France is forced to adopt some sort of Diet of Augsburg-style compromise? Only about 12% of the French population by the middle of the century is Calvinist. That's about 2 million people out of a population of about 19 million. And as this map shows, Protestant communities are scattered across France. The green dots indicate a community with a single Protestant church, and these tend to be clustered in particular in the south and the southwest of France. The orange dots indicate more sizable Protestant communities, and they form an anti-clockwise arc running southwest from Paris towards the Bay of Biscay, and then southeast towards Avignon, before curving north again to Lyon, France's second biggest city. But also note there's quite a large cluster of Protestants around Navarre, which is close to the Spanish border. Although these Protestant communities are scattered, what mattered enormously to the crown was that nearly half of the Protestants in France were nobles of some form or another. As I said, this is potentially troubling to the French crown because of the Diet of Augsburg. But think of it as well from the perspective of the French king. The French king has, as I suggested already, effective control over the Catholic Church in his lands. He says nice things about the Pope in Rome, but that's about it. In reality, the French king rules over the French Catholic Church. But of course, he would have no influence over these Calvinists. There'd be a separate church. So the French king's authority would actually be weakened in these Calvinist areas if the Calvinists made extensive gains. As these Calvinist communities gain confidence, they become determined to challenge the Catholics directly. These Calvinists find some of these Catholic uses, some of the Catholic practices, to be abhorrent. Catholics weren't Christians, they argued. They were papists, because they worship not Christ, they worship the Pope. So Calvinists become more aggressive. They begin to smash up some of the more idolatrous trappings in Catholic churches. They don't like all the statutes, all the arts in Catholic churches. To Calvinists, these signify false idols, false gods. They argue that these Catholics are worshipping images, not God himself. When they hear Catholic preachers, often now Calvinists are so bold that they interrupt them mid-sermon. They contradict them as they're preaching. And you can imagine what happens in these sorts of circumstances. Street battles become increasingly common between Catholics and Calvinists across the country. And by the end of the 1550s, both sides are beginning to mobilize armed men. But just that time that much of France is mobilizing for hostilities between Calvinists and Catholics, the French monarchy was thrown into turmoil. In 1559, attending ceremonies for the marriage of his daughter, King Henry II decided to participate in a tournament that was being waged. As this engraving shows, Henry fancies himself as a bit of a jouster. And here he is, jousting against the Seigneur de Loge on that very day. Unfortunately for him, during the course of this joust, he was hit in the face with the butt of the Seigneur's broken lance. The engraving shows the lance scattered with pieces strewn across the jousting field. Henry's wound was serious. He was taken back to his bedchamber. And this engraving shows him lying in his deathbed. He's being attended by a priest, as you can see, but in the foreground are all of the doctors. Henry had probably the best doctor of the 16th century attending him, a fellow called Ambrose Paré. He's the fellow at the table wearing the flat cap. Paré had actually made a name for himself, specializing 30 years earlier, treating infections, and treating them successfully. Nevertheless, there was absolutely nothing Paré could do for Henry's wounds. On the 10th of July, 1559, Henry died from septicemia. Unfortunately, Henry's heir was a sickly 15-year-old boy, Francis II, who is king from 1559 to the very next year, 1560. Francis was pretty dim, he was weak, and he was sickly, and as I suggested, he lasts just 18 months. Francis's death, though, deepens the crisis because he is succeeded by his brother, Charles, who becomes Charles IX. But Charles is just 9 years old. Here he is, King Charles IX, as painted by the French court painter François Clouet in 1561. Like his little brother, according to contemporary accounts, Charles had little to recommend him except a fair complexion and a round, pretty face, as you can see from this picture. During this period, the one stabilizing influence in France was Henry II's widow, the Queen Mother. This is Catherine de' Medici. This is another of Clouet's works, picture of Catherine herself, as she was round about 1555, so just before she became a widow. The Venetian ambassador at the royal court at this time was a man named Giovanni Capello, and he said that Catherine was not particularly attractive. He said that her mouth was too large and her eyes too prominent and colorless to be considered beautiful. But then he later concedes that she was a very distinguished-looking woman with a shapely figure, beautiful skin, and exquisitely shaped hands. But Catherine was far more than this. She was a very clever, very capable woman, and she was well aware of the dangers facing France at just this time. And during the reigns of her son Francis and then her son Charles, it was Catherine who held the real reins of power. No decision was taken without Catherine. Her problem was always going to be the need to prevent hostilities. And it was never going to be easy. How do you stop these Calvinists and these Catholics attacking each other? A good chunk of her most powerful nobles were Calvinists by now. But she realized if she made concessions to them, that's going to anger the Catholics. But if she throws in a lot with the Catholics, then she'd lose the support of a chunk of her Calvinist nobility. And of course, if she does nothing, then that's just going to annoy everybody. So she's stuck between a rock and a hard place. How do you make peace between these two factions? How do you bridge this gap between these two sides and hold France together and avoid it falling into civil war? Well, the short answer is she couldn't. By 1562, the situation had deteriorated into civil war. On one side, there was the Guise family. They're the head of the Catholic faction, and they're hugely ambitious. On the other side, they're the Huguenots, and they're led by a man called Henry of Navarre. The first round of hostilities dragged on until 1572. In 1572, it looked like both sides were willing to come to some sort of agreement to end the bloodshed. And a peace agreement was hammered out. And the two sides agreed to a large celebration on St. Bartholomew's Day in Paris. That's the 24th of August, 1572. And to cement this deal, to ensure that the treaty would hold, the king's Catholic sister is going to marry the champion of the Protestant cause, Henry of Navarre. Thousands of Huguenots came to Paris for this occasion. But at this point, Catherine became suspicious. She was convinced that the Calvinists in France had become too powerful. She's being egged on in the background by the Catholic King of Spain and by the Pope. And as a result of their prodding, she lent her support to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre on the 22nd of August, 1572. The situation is this. The wedding festivities have just concluded. Henry of Navarre and the king's sister have just been married. Across Paris, the Huguenots are readying to go home. But suddenly, the Huguenots are attacked by hordes of Catholics. And the result is this. They were butchered. This is a painting done by the French Huguenot artist François Dubois, done in the decade immediately after the massacre. And it really gives you a sense of the scale of the violence. Somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 French Calvinists were murdered on the streets of Paris that day. The next 3 days saw the bloodletting spill out of Paris and across the countryside. There were major massacres in a dozen other French towns. Around 20,000 French Protestants were slain. Pope Gregory XIII reportedly greeted news of the slaughter of so many Protestants with special religious celebrations. Catherine, though, realized that she'd gone too far. It wasn't just that the massacre inflamed religious hostilities and plunged the country into civil wars again. But in giving her support to the Catholics, she completely undermined the moral authority of the crown. It's now going to be exceptionally difficult for her ever to win the trust of the Huguenots back again. So when the Huguenots were able to regroup in the weeks after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, they no longer claimed to be fighting against the influence of the Catholic Guise family. No, the Huguenots now see themselves as fighting against a corrupt French monarchy. In May 1574, King Charles IX died, and he's succeeded by his brother, who becomes Henry III. This is Henry III as he was around about 1570, so just before he came to the throne. This is painted by the king's official portrait painter, and by that point it was a man named Jean de Cour. Henry III was much brighter than his other brothers, but he had another advantage as well. They'd come to the throne as children. Henry, though, when he succeeded to the monarchy, was 23 years old. Catholics were delighted when Henry came to the throne. They hoped that Henry would take charge and help them smash the remains of Protestantism across France. He didn't. In the first place, Henry wasn't particularly interested. He preferred to devote his energies to more physical pleasures. He had dozens of mistresses, and it was rumored even in his time that he had homosexual lovers as well. But the other thing was, Henry didn't have the money to wage war. The crown had had to pay for the last couple of rounds of hostilities on credit, and now those debts were becoming due. So instead of a new war, the French Catholics got a new round of taxes to pay for the previous war. Of course, that doesn't endear him to anybody. But in June 1584, the situation took a strange turn. Henry had got married quickly after he came to the throne, but he never had a child. Under French law, the next in the line to the throne would be Henry's younger brother. But in June 1584, his younger brother died of tuberculosis. The next in line to the throne was his cousin, Henry of Navarre, the Protestant Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot champion Henry of Navarre. This meant that there was a very real chance that when Henry III died, the throne would pass to a Calvinist. This prospect absolutely terrified French Catholics. They were determined to do anything they could to prevent this possibility. They were even prepared to take the ultimate step. They were prepared to make a deal with Catholic Spain. Spain had been France's main rival on the continent for a generation and a half, but French Catholics were prepared to sell out their own national interests in the name of religion to prevent the possibility of a Protestant coming to the throne. And for their part, the Spanish were very keen on this deal. The idea of a Protestant France in the middle of the continent was absolutely unacceptable to the Catholic Spanish. But this alliance between the French Catholics and the Spanish Catholics leaves Henry caught in the middle. He's Catholic, but his heir is Calvinist. But the head of the Catholic faction, the faction he was much more likely to side with if push came to the shove, he'd made a deal with the country's main international rival. If France's Catholics are prepared to sell out their country, clearly, Henry reasoned, they can't be trusted. So Henry realizes that he has to make a peace deal with Henry of Navarre. And so that's what happens. The two Henrys, Henry III and Henry of Navarre, strike a deal. King Henry will recognize Henry of Navarre as his heir. And in exchange, Henry of Navarre would help the king deal with his disloyal Catholic subjects. But this deal raises a lot of troubling questions. What would happen to France under a Protestant monarchy? Would France become a Protestant country? I've already mentioned that the possibility of a Diet of Augsburg solution was quite troubling. But perhaps Henry of Navarre might go further. Perhaps he'd insist that all of France would become Calvinist. Or perhaps Henry might not go as far as that. Perhaps he'd leave the Catholics alone. But could he really do that? Was it possible for a king to rule a country if he is a different religion to the majority of his population? That's new territory. That's new political territory. And to many, this is very worrying stuff. News of this deal between the two Henrys tips the Catholics over the edge. Across France, Catholic preachers go out of their way to preach against the king. Catholic printers are printing fanatical, anti-royalist pamphlets, and these things are being snapped up on the street. One young man got caught up in all of this anti-royalist frenzy was a young Catholic monk named Jacques Clément. Clément was a Catholic fanatic, and he was absolutely scandalized, outraged at the idea that the King of France could make a deal to hand over his kingdom to a heretic. He talked openly with his friends, or anybody who would listen to him, about killing the king. And many Catholics egged him on. They pointed out that removing a tyrant like King Henry III would earn him eternal salvation. Remember that on the Catholic side, doing good deeds, that's what gets you into heaven. So killing a tyrant like Henry III, that might get you into heaven. So that's what Jacques Clément tried to do. On the 1st of August 1589, Clément disguised himself as a priest, and he begged to be allowed in to see the king in his chamber. He said that he had some important secret news to tell the king. Once he was in the king's chamber, Clement leaned in towards the king as if he was going to whisper this secret in his ear. But then he pulled out a dagger from underneath his coat and he stabbed Henry. Henry died from his wounds the very next day. Clement, of course, was caught immediately and killed by the king's attendants. His body was then quartered and burned. In the Catholic world, though, he was seen initially as a martyr, and for a while there was even talk about making him into a saint. But what Clement had done, of course, was to realize his own fears. With Henry III dead, the way to the throne was open to Henry of Navarre. Henry of Navarre becomes king then in 1589, after the assassination of Henry III. So he becomes King Henry IV, and this is Henry IV as he's painted by the painter Santi di Tito around about 1600. Though Henry had succeeded to the throne, he had to spend the next 5 years fighting to assert his title. But even once he'd been able to secure his position as king, he still had to deal with the thorny issue of religion. The bottom line was he going to try and rule Catholic France as a Protestant king? Could he do that? Or could he somehow bring the two sides together and avoid a war? What he did, though, was rather clever and rather devious. In July 1593, he announced publicly that he had converted to Catholicism. There's a famous story that says he justifies this decision by saying, quite crassly, "Paris, it's worth a mass." In other words, he's prepared to put aside his religious convictions, his true religious sensibilities, and go to mass if it means keeping keeping France together. The story, unfortunately, isn't true. It's put about by Catholic opponents to suggest that he's nothing more than a hypocrite. But what his conversion did was to take the steam out of his opponents. Of course, his old Catholic opponents claimed that his conversion was not sincere, that he was still, of course, a heretic underneath it all. And the Pope called upon Henry immediately to prove the sincerity of his conversion by stamping out and eliminating all traces of Protestantism across the kingdom. Eliminating these Protestants, that would be adequate penance for all these years Henry had spent as a heretic, the Pope said. But moderate Catholics found it pragmatic to take the king at face value. At the very least, his conversion meant that their faith was not going to be threatened. The monarchy wasn't going to use its power to force them to become Calvinists, as had happened in England by this point. But what about all of Henry's old Protestant allies? What do you do about them? Obviously, they're going to be fairly annoyed about this conversion. Well, in May 1598, Henry issues quite a remarkable document. It's called the Edict of Nantes. And this is the document itself. For such an important revolutionary document, it actually doesn't look that imposing. But it really is revolutionary. The Edict of Nantes is an attempt to find a solution to the religious question once and for all. What the edict did was it gave French Protestants a good measure of religious freedom. French Protestants would be allowed to worship the way that they wanted to in various Catholic towns across the country. Where there were Huguenot nobles, the edict went further. In these territories, where the noble was a Huguenot, they were given complete religious freedom. Remember the Peace of Augsburg? Well, there's something similar going on here. The edict also allowed Calvinists to serve in government office, to be part of public service. They were allowed to have their own schools too. And Henry made sure that Huguenots would get fair treatment under the law, even if the judges were Catholics. Of course, the edict wasn't popular with Henry's new Catholic friends, and it wasn't actually popular with Henry's old Protestant allies either. But it did win him the support of the moderates, The moderates who want to end the bloodshed. The moderates who are sick of seeing Frenchmen massacre other Frenchmen, with the support of the King of France and the Pope. The edict is a remarkable document, for it accepts the possibility that two religious faiths can live together in the same country. As we've seen, politics and religion have been intertwined ever since the days of the Emperor Constantine. But now, what we've got here is Henry arguing for an idea of religious coexistence. It's all motivated by pragmatic politics. But the result is that the edict is a very progressive, very forward-thinking move. France had been racked by civil war for the previous 30 years. The edict put an end to that. It gave France time to rebuild. And over the next 12 years of Henry's reign, we see something of an economic revival in France. And that strength, that confidence is nicely captured in this portrait of the king, done by Franz Porbus the Younger in 1610, just a bit before Henry himself was killed. The king here is decked out in his armor, posing confidently. I think the picture quite nicely personifies the revitalized French monarchy that you get after the Edict of Nantes. But the French would need all their strength. For in the 1630s, the country would be sucked into another war. This is a war on an altogether different scale. It's Europe's first continent-wide conflict. Every power was involved at one point or another. It was the most bloody, most costly, most violent war in European history up to World War I. This is the 30 Years' War. It begins in Bohemia, a Protestant part of the Holy Roman Empire, in 1618, and that's where we'll be turning in the next video.